Okay, my intention is for this to be the last video that I ever post regarding the question of anti-natalism versus natalism, and my own conviction, of course, as an existential pessimist, a radical depressive realist, my own conviction that anti-natalism is just ethically the correct position to have regarding reproduction. It's logically the only consistent position to have, and so forth. This is going to be my final statement, I hope. But my last video was regarding specifically just this, and I stand by everything I said. However, I admit that I didn't go into any great detail, so it's understandable that there was confusion in the comments. I'm not judging anyone for being confused about it, but this still stands. We'll get to that, but I'm going to lay out just a further picture, but I think this is a sufficient, this is adequately rigorous, and you'll notice it's just one page. This is not a complicated argument. That's really the issue here. So when I'm saying natalism is a fundamentalism, I'll just cut to the chase and say it is fundamentalism because it, with no reasoning, right, just as a belief system, it denies all of these logically consistent, again, observations. These are observations within the context of mathematical philosophy, and you can choose to, deconstructively, speculatively question all of mathematical philosophy. That's fine. However, inasmuch as you're committed to, obvious things within that context, obviously logically consistent things within the context of consensus math, I'm going to show that this column, the anti-natalist column of ideas, is logically consistent. These are all just very obvious mathematical statements. That's what I mean by observations, is that you don't have to do much intellectual work to see these things. They're just very obvious. Whereas everything over here is mathematically inconsistent. This just doesn't make any sense. And you can subjectively weight this column to say that it makes sense according to your belief system, but that's fundamentalism, right? That's a form of fideism, fundamentalist fideism. You're saying, I just believe that this is consistent or complete as an argument, but it's not, according to the presupposition of just basic logical consistency. Anyway, so with anti-natalism, the position where human beings freely choose to not reproduce. That's all this is. Again, it's an observation of that phenomenon, not the theory of why this is ethically superior as a choice and so forth. This is just the acknowledgement that there's such a thing as human beings consciously choosing to not reproduce. That's a thing. I'm an example of such a person, right? But there are many others. We are, unfortunately, a minority, but anyway. What happens, right, when you choose to not reproduce? What comes after you in the sequence of human beings? Zero. There's zero people, right? Duh, that's an obvious thing. If everyone was an antinatalist, then we would go extinct within the youngest extant generation. How many human beings would come after that? Zero. Meaning, the overall population of human beings at any given moment, should everyone be somehow, absolute antinatalists, that number is determinate and countable, assuming that we could account for every human being. It's a countable number, and like any determinate, countable, finite number, nothing comes after it. Right? You have a cutoff line, zero things after that. Very obvious statement. Over here, though, you have the assumption that human life is just infinitely extended into the future, right? So natalism is simply the observation that human beings reproduce. We have reproduced. We've never failed to reproduce sufficiently thus far into our history. And the consequence of that process continuing uninterrupted, right, is just an infinite sequence of human beings, and each human being reproduces an unknown amount in the sequence of other human beings who reproduce an unknown amount of other human beings, right? So this is an uncountable, indeterminate infinity. In this sense, it's uncountable. Yeah, you're right. Like, it's indeterminate. However, the manifest, snapshot of human beings at any given moment is still, in theory, countable, right? If you could freeze that moment. However, the overall count is unknown because it's extended infinitely. So the thing to understand here is that qualitatively, this means that this infinity is both positive and negative, meaning it includes all of the problems, all of the negative aspects of human experience, however we parse that, and all of the positives, right? Like, this, again, is a very obvious thing. However, what is the number of natalists who acknowledge this, who accept that, like, yeah, human existence being extended infinitely into the future means you have infinite negatives and infinite positives, irreducibly. How many people can acknowledge that who are natalists? I've never met one, right? That's why I'm still considering this contradictory, because this isn't usually what a natalist actually believes in. What they believe is that this infinitude can be reduced to a positive, to an exclusively positive infinity, or that from this you can derive a positive infinity that's bigger in scope than the negative. And that's not, again, that idea makes no mathematical sense. A positive sequence of, an infinite sequence of positives cannot be reduced into an infinite sequence of negatives. It's both positive and negative. It implies, every positive implies two negatives. It can be opened up, if you will, in that way. And similarly, every infinite sequence of negatives implies an infinite sequence of positives, irreducibly, in as much as the infinite sequence is not positive, or is not even or odd, and therefore can't be counted, such that there's a definite number of positive signs and so forth. Anyway, so this is true, however, according to the usual assumption of this belief system, no one's willing to acknowledge this. Okay, and then what I went into in the last video is just that non-reproduction is a continuous process. Reproduction is a discrete process in as much as we count one person as only one person in a population theory sense, right? So, like, that's just the obvious assumption about how to count people, is that there's a discrete number of them, that we use natural numbers, not real numbers. So at most, this infinite sequence of naturally numbered human beings will be an Aleph null infinity. It'll be a countable infinity. In all likelihood, it'll actually just be an indeterminate finitude, meaning, oops, we're going to go extinct anyway, so whether we like it or not, we're going to have a determinate count after which there's 0 human beings. Which is already, like, hint, hint, why are we stalling that conclusion for no reason? But anyway, so this is true. Like, finitude over here is less than infinitude. Also, an Aleph 1 infinity is bigger than an Aleph null infinity, and also, of course, an indeterminate finitude. I don't know how to make this any clearer than that. If you'd imagine, like, the first human being to ever do anything, right? Like a quintuple backflip from standing on flat ground. You're the first human being to ever do that crazy feat. Everyone says, wow, that's amazing, and now you know how to do that, so we've been we need to make up for lost time. All the time that we've been wasting not doing quintuple backflips as human beings. So we need to do the maximum amount of quintuple backflips. Just keep doing them and teach other people how to do them, and then eventually we'll catch up to that lost time. No, you won't, right? Like, it doesn't matter what we're talking about here. That's impossible, right? Because there's not just a naturally numbered, countable, listable, infinite sequence of non-quintuple backflips. There's a unbroken continuity right, where no quintuple backflips were occurring. You can't you can't catch up. No matter how we're qualifying the content of whatever these cardinalities of infinitude are referring to, this distinction holds, right? And people will refuse to acknowledge all of this, but this is just math. This is basic math. It's just mathematical observation at this point. Yes, you can take question, or you can question the underlying math, but it's consensus, basic, obvious math. That's the point. So again, 0 is a finite number. It's less than positive infinity. 0 is also a finite number that is greater than negative infinity. Right? Meaning, I can't convince anyone to focus exclusively on the negatives or recognize that there's an asymmetry in experience between the negative and the positive, which, to me and to any existential pessimist of the Schopenhauerian sort, this is an obvious thing, right? Like, Schopenhauer basically said that any conviction that you have that life is sustainably positive in quality is an illusion. It's what he would call a decoy, right? But you can't force someone to see that, right? So we acknowledge that, by humans going extinct, whatever the reason, including voluntary anti-natalism or just being driven to extinction by either our foolishness or natural indifference. You no longer have all of the positives, right? You don't have your Beethoven Ninth Symphonies. You don't have your ayahuasca ceremonies where everyone has a good time and doesn't die of heart failure or whatever. And then you don't have your creme brulee desserts, right? You don't have your walks on the beach at sunset and so forth. Great. However, you're also avoiding infinite horror. So that's kind of important. And when you get back to the notion that, no, don't worry, we can reduce that infinite horror, we can solve this. No, you can't. Mathematically speaking, you can't. Unless we're talking about a different thing. That's already a huge problem. But just to make it clear, what we're saying is that, horror, meaning what? Well, specifically, horrifying forms of suffering and the horror of death, which is just the contradictoriness that we have to hold within ourselves as human beings, knowing of the inevitability, the unpredictability, and the likely painful reality of death. You get rid of that by going extinct, right? There's no more of that. This is an undeniable, again, observation. If the question is, how do you solve all of humanity's problems, the part where you just cease to manifest any of those problems is a solution. It's a logically consistent solution. It's not acceptable as a solution to the natalist perspective, again, because it's a belief system. Just like, materialist realism is an explanatory model that works. It's consistent. It's not complete, but it's consistent. However, you can't convince a fundamentalist Christian or Jew or Muslim, any one of the Abrahamic faiths in particular, but there are plenty of other ones. You can't convince any such person to take that seriously, right? They're just going to believe that there's this other thing, that there's this other model which is not provably consistent, nor is it provably complete. It's both inconsistent and incomplete, but they're just going to, believe that. So the fact that this is a solution to the problem of problems themselves, right? Manifesting any problem. You can't convince anyone to take that seriously. However, that is true. It's mathematically true. Whereas over here, there's this... These are all very problematic. So there's the idea that you can, again, reduce this positive and negative infinity to an exclusively positive thing. And the idea is that you can remove the negative infinities, right? Like, you can get these to cancel out and equal zero problems. Now, anyone who's familiar with, say, like, first-year calculus, I guess, knows that this statement is technically true in a sense. However, it's misleading because positive infinity minus negative infinity, this is what's called an indeterminate form by mathematicians, meaning Yes, it equals zero, however, it equals anything. Meaning this statement is trivially meaningless. This is not an argument. This is not a compelling argument, because it doesn't exclude any other conclusion, including all of this. So this isn't relevant, right? It's not applicable. So the assumption that on this basis, according to this model, well, we have if we infinitely extend human life, we have an infinite amount of time during which to solve all of our problems, right? So we can solve the problem of suffering, we can solve the problem of death. In fact, we can only do that by extending human life infinitely so that we have enough time in which to do it. Forget this obvious solution over here. We just believe that doesn't apply for no reason, but we're going to focus on this. However, okay, what is your solution then? Like, what is it about this that will allow for that? Nothing. Nothing. There is no people will say, well, like, genetic engineering. It's like, yeah, where's the part where genetic engineering already solves this enough to, justify increasing the overall number of problems, increasing the amount of suffering and death? There is no such thing, right? These are illusions. These are Star Trek fantasies. This doesn't... you can believe in this all you want, and nothing I say will convince you otherwise. However, all of this is mathematically, logically inconsistent. None of this makes any consensus-level sense in any, ordinary mathematical context. All of this does make sense, though, in a fundamentalist religious context. Right? This is just how people operate in those contexts. You just claim things for subjectively, emotional reasons, basically, and you don't worry about doing the math. Whereas over here, all of this is not only mathematically consistent, but obvious, right? These are just obvious things. This is what I mean by observations, and not theories. These aren't wild, theoretical, abstract claims. These are very simple notions, right? So anti-natalism is ultimately just a very obvious conclusion regarding the phenomenon, just the math of reproduction. It's a very obvious observation of what that math is. And the anti-natalist conclusion, the actual argument for non-reproduction, just focuses on this very, again, basic thing, which is if the problem is problems, then stop making problems. Right? It's just that simple. If there's any problem at all to existing in the first place, and an existential pessimist takes that for granted, right? That's just an obvious aspect of this existence, is that it's unacceptably horrifying, right? Well, then stop making more of it. That's all it is. And we can get into the more complicated implications of this for society, given the fact that people aren't going to stop reproducing. So we have then the question of, within this context, what is the theoretically optimal way to live, to go on living, if you're not going to just kill yourself to eject from this system, right? That's a more complicated question, of course, and I will go into that more, but this is all I'm going to say on this, I hope, because as I see it, this is all that needs to be said. This is very simple. So people will continue to come and claim that they have some kind of compelling argument against all of this being relevant somehow. And again, sure, you can confront all of mathematics, all of logic, all of mathematical philosophy, all of set theory, all of just, predicate calculus and so forth. You can go ahead and throw that all in the wood chipper. But congratulations, you make no sense now. And that's, yeah, you're a human being. You're entitled to make no sense. You're also inevitably going to fail to make sense, as I do and as everyone does. But, yeah, this is just obvious shit. The end.